People give me more shit than I used to get, and it's kind of annoying.
We are on air. That's okay. I can edit that out unless you don't mind. Yeah, I think. Well, we have voice. All right. That should be our new lead, and I should just record that, and that should be our new lead into every podcast. Welcome to another edition of EveryoneHatesCleveland.com. Oh, Jesus. Now I'm definitely going to have to edit that out. All right, hold on. Christ.
I think you should just post this online. Everybody should get our outtakes early just so they can experience
Oh, it's going to be there on YouTube, so. All right, here we go.
The entrance.
Okay.
Let me lock it in.
Welcome to another edition of Everyone Hates Cleveland, the podcast. I'm your host, Jim Pete, joined by my healthy and wonderful and not tired at all because he's not heading into the worst part of the school year for any other reason. My co-host, well, that is the lead-in from hell. My co-host, Michael Hattery, of course. Mike, if you're on YouTube, as I'm staring at your ceiling, how is life? All this is getting cut. This is just the worst.
All right.
All right, hold on. I'm going to start again.
Does that mean I'm going to have to leave and come back?
All right, here we go. Oh, okay. Welcome to another edition of Everyone Hates Cleveland, the podcast. I'm your host, Jim Pete. Today, joined once again by my co-host, my partner in crime, and who's feeling quite snarky tonight, Mike Hattery. Mike, how are you doing today?
I am quite swell, Jim. Quite swell.
So I'm trying to figure out if the bitterness that we're about to see is caused by the fun of the winter meetings and all of the quote unquote rumors, or if you're just pissed off because, in between now and the end of your actual school year is a whole lot of, shit.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, I've been told by my wife that I've become, an incredibly irritating person for, the 2 weeks surrounding and including final exams. So I certainly would concede that is the case. But also, I think just the way we've sort of moved with how baseball news is reported on Twitter and the competition involved in building your brand and reporting information. I think that's a big part of it too. It bothers me at the trade deadline as much as it bothers me in the winter meetings.
Well, my favorite tweet today, and these are the ones that make me want to just pile drive someone through a wall. From John Heyman today. There is said to be a, quote, mystery team, unquote, in McCutchen talks that has not been mentioned publicly yet. Not surprising. Great player. Now, I'm sorry, but these, quote, unquote, mystery teams that they put in these damn tweets so that we keep hitting refresh so that they can ever post the actual mystery team is just a joke. My question is, has anybody ever actually announced said mystery team? Has said mystery team ever actually gotten the player?
No, this is a delightful bullshit device where John Heyman admits that he doesn't really know what's going on with the Andrew McCutchen sweepstakes right now. So he has to, A, keep the McCutchen sweepstakes in the news and act like he's tied into it. And B, he has to establish the possibility that the Nationals aren't going to be dealing for McCutchen, in which case another team will have to. So that's where we slap mystery team in because there are 28 other teams that could trade for him. And when he is dealt to a team potentially other than the Nationals, then Heyman can be like, oh, they were the mystery team. Saw it all along. Sure you did, John. Sure you did.
Well, I mean, the funny thing about that is most quote unquote mystery teams are perfectly content being out there. It's especially mind-numbing for reporters covering the Indians because, of course, the minute you see a mystery team at a position that the Indians need, said tweet becomes a thing, which is kind of where we're at right now. I mean, the only link that the Indians have had sort of, I don't know, background to it has been Matt Holliday, who, of course, last night signed with the New York Yankees for 1 year, $13 million deal. So, first off, before we get into today and possibilities for the Indians, and I do want to talk a little bit about the CBA, in particular the 10-day DL, I do want to talk about Holliday because, Mike, you wrote a piece almost 3 weeks ago now discussing the Indians and Matt Holliday being a good fit. When asked about the money, I believe you told me $10 million with the potential to go up to $15 million. With incentives, which turns out to be pretty dead on. The Yankees signed him to a $13 million deal. To my knowledge, I think that's just a straight up 1 year, $13 million deal. I don't know if there's any incentives in there, although there usually are a few incentives. My question to you, Mike, is, the Indians were supposedly in on that deal. Is this a scenario where the Indians may have offered more than $13 million and Holliday just wanted to be a Yankee? Or did the Indians perhaps do what you said, offer him a $10 million 1 year deal, and rather than worry about incentives, he just took the $13 million deal? Or did they just do what they supposedly did with Edwin Encarnacion and, call him and say, hey, we have an opening. Would you like it? I don't know. What are you thinking? It seems like the Indians would be in even for 1 year and $13 million, if not even a little bit more than that. So, why weren't the Indians an actual player in this deal? Like, why couldn't they outbid the Yankees?
I'm just sort of curious. My expectation is that what the Indians will do is a lot of times the ultimate dollar figure will be similar, but they have to mitigate risk, essentially. So what they'll do is I would think they put like a basis of 9 to 10 million on Holliday, and then might have incentives gotten him to basically where the Yankees had him. But I think they just are going to mitigate against risk and not offer, 13, 14 guaranteed to someone with that sort of injury risk. And I was really high on Holliday, but he's also 38. And he's someone who is basically someone who's, like, for a small market team, built for an incentive laden deal where he gets a good base. And then if he plays really well, you play up his incentives. And I bet they were serious contenders in terms of overall money, but I'm betting their base lock-in was a lot. It was maybe 3 or 4 million lower.
Well, so, we talk about the Indians and money, and I think my big question when you start seeing salaries like this, and, we have relievers signing for $15+ million, and my concern Indians wise is if you look at the money numbers, they are sitting, we've talked about this before in our last podcast, right now they're sitting at about 70 million in salary after they sign all these players, even though they let go of Manship, after they sign all of their players in arbitration, they'll be somewhere, plus the 6 or 7 other players that they'll need to sign to get to the 25-man limit. They'll be somewhere in the area of $105 million, give or take. They could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less. Now, memory serves me, they were right in that realm at the end of last year, which to me is a little bit over budget, at least last year. This year, their budget may be 105, maybe 107, maybe a 103, depending on who you listen to. So my question, Mike, is, my initial question to all this is the reason why I've been throwing all in on trades is because it's a way for them to dump salary on one hand and acquire salary on the other. If they're legitimately going in on these guys, even for 9 million, even for 10 million, is this a sign that they're willing to go over budget, or is there something else in the works? I.e., you and I have both talked about Brian Shaw perhaps getting let go, other guys such as Lonnie Chisenhall. Is that the scenario? I mean, are they really willing to part with a couple of guys that we know Terry Francona likes to bring in a guy like Holliday, or perhaps even, at the high end of that, if they can somehow figure out a way to get Encarnacion here in a 2-year deal, would they be willing to take on a $20 million contract? Is this something that you see? I mean, this is definitely the Indians, and especially a guy like Chris Antonetti.
I'm going to do one of those things where I partially answer your question and then talk about the thing I want to talk about. Just kidding. No, I'm kidding. That's a great question. I think I'm really intrigued by baseball finance for many reasons, but I think the Indians are particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. I think they view other teams understanding what their payroll caps as being as dangerous for them. It's more advantageous for them to understand their own flexibility and try and eliminate that from hitting the market. And I think they're a team that's really good at it. I mean, this is a team where we were talking, oh, their cap's 85 or 90 million last year. By the end of the season, it had flexed up to 105. This is a team where John Heyman said that there's no way that they can afford an Andrew Miller deal. It's financially untenable for the Indians. And then 3 days later, they had set up deals for both Lucroy and Miller, which would have spiked their money even more to probably 110 to 115. So I think they're an organization where I'm actually not that sure where their lock-in is. We know they made a bunch of money in Game 6 and 7. Their season ticket sales are seeing pretty significant growth. I'm not sure where their cap is actually, and I think that's how they want it. And so I mean, the Encarnacion thing is a joke, but also what bothers me is when people like Buster Olney pretend to know what the Indians salary ceiling is. I don't think we really know, because I think they operate in a way that they don't want you to know. So I'm not saying Encarnacion's possible, but I am saying I don't really know what is possible in terms of how they'll flex their budget.
Well, we should talk about Encarnacion because we hear he turns down a 4-year $80 million deal, and then if you're to believe anybody, of course, earlier this morning, I believe it was Jeff Passan from Yahoo who said that the Indians checked in on Encarnacion. With of course he's a right-handed power bat in the left-handed heavy lineup. He mentioned that as well. The question is, would they spend the money? Well, I mean, to me, the only way the Indians legitimately have a shot at a guy like Encarnacion is if he does believe that he can't get a 4-year deal. To me, he's automatically going to get probably a 3 or 4-year deal just based on his power numbers, just based on his overall numbers offensively. And he fills, a need for a lot of different teams because of, he can play first base, he can DH. I guess worst case scenarios, he takes a 2-year deal. You mentioned 2 years and 45. I'll sign for a little bit more if it's only for 2 years. I mean, I just mentioning. And listen, I think Passan's one of the better journalists out there. He's written some amazing pieces, in particular on baseball, over the past couple of years, including his Jose Fernandez piece he wrote earlier this year. I think he's a really good journalist. This is one of those things where he hears a whisper and he posts it. I mean, was this the Indians checking on Encarnacion, or were they just, calling the agent and seeing, is there any possibility he could sign for a 1-year deal, knowing full well they'll say no and that this rumor will get out there so it looks like they're active? Or is it a smokescreen? Because we know the Indians do like smokescreens.
I really wonder if they, I think one of the things that they're looking at is if you have a post-35 guy who thinks he can do better in the next year or something like that. I think both Encarnacion and Batista are guys who we're seeing dominoes fall really fast in the first base DH market. We've seen the Yankees took themselves off the board early with Holliday, setting themselves up to really splurge on a good first base class in 2017. We've seen a couple other teams with a need there take themselves off the board. And I think this was the Indians saying, that we're seeing a diminishing marketplace for people who actually have a really strong need in this area. There's a chance that Encarnacion wants to just try his luck next year and produce for another season, especially if he doesn't get the guaranteed money he's going to get this year. And the Blue Jays sort of pulled the carpet out from under him and went and got their guys, taking themselves off the market. So I kind of think this is the Indians saying, yeah, they're not players for him on a 4-year deal. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but I think they are players for him on a 1 year, maybe 2-year deal where he tries to set himself up again to take advantage of a market. And I think I'm sort of interested to see what happens to Jose Batista. I don't think he's an outfielder anymore. I think he could play first base and DH. I think he's going to slide late into the winter. One of him and Encarnacion are, and there aren't going to be a lot of teams that really have a good place for him. I think they're both sort of DHs at this point. And I think there's a good chance, and I'm not saying they'll fall into range, but we've seen this before where there's a big chunk in the market, teams knock off what they need early, and all of a sudden somebody's sitting out there and you can get them for 80 cents, 75 cents on the dollar.
Well, I mean, the Indians do have a tendency to wait for players like, Batista seems to be a guy that many people are talking about perhaps falling through the cracks. Another one of those guys is Mike Napoli, the whole created by Mike Napoli. As we see all of these signings, if Mike Napoli is truly looking for a 3 or 4 year deal, as has been reported, I mean, it seems to me that as far as pipe dreams go, it seems like this one is a pretty sizable pipe dream. And this is no rip on Mike Napoli. He did provide value this year. You could make a case that his especially his all-star break run was as meaningful to the Indians as many of the players who came through as the year progressed. But, I think as he tailed off in a big way in the late summer and all the way through the playoffs, Napoli becomes a guy. And again, I don't want to get crucified and as people listen to this, but Mike Napoli became a bit of an albatross around the team's neck. A lot of big at bats that he struck out or didn't come through in the playoffs, aside from a game or two against the Blue Jays. Is it possible though that this team looks back to Mike Napoli as a guy they could sign perhaps a little cheaper than he thought to perhaps a 2-year deal? I mean, is we know that Terry Francona likes his guys. I mean, could this be one of those scenarios where when they get right down to it, Mike Napoli's still sitting there and he calls back, the front office and they end up signing Mike Napoli and bring him back?
Yeah, I think Napoli is in really big trouble financially. I don't think he's where he wanted to be. I mean, not financially, obviously. He probably has $30 million in the bank, and I have student loans. I'm not going to say that, but I would say, yeah, his market is not good. It's not a good market. I think to me, the more favorable guy to bet on for 1 year was Holliday, and I think most people would agree, and he got 1 in 13. I think that's a pretty hard cap on what sort of deal Mike Napoli is going to get, especially with the way he looked really from August 1 on, and a spiking K rate. He can't play first that well anymore. I think there's a really good chance that he basically gets the same sort of deal as he did last year. I mean, maybe it's raised a little, but this is a brutal market. I think it's a really good chance he falls right back into the Indians' lap. Just because there isn't anybody who's really going to go multi-years with a guy who's showing that many signs of collapse.
Well, let's look at the Indians. Let's step away from this for a second. There are some guys I want to talk about who have been mentioned in the past few hours that I do want to talk about, but let's look at the Indians. So if we're to be real about this, we have them sitting at 105 million, give or take. Is the reality here, Mike, that the Indians do have to be a bit tentative because it would, especially with the way that the new CBA is written up. There's been a lot of talk that a lot of franchises, because of the way that the CB and luxury tax thresholds, give or take, are written, that it benefits teams to sign their current players to their youngsters through arbitration to save dollars so that they don't go over each team's specific threshold. So here's my question. Is it possible that the Indians are going to lay back because they are probably, you'd have to believe that this is the offseason in which you talk to a guy like Francisco Lindor, who now has, over 18 months of really good play. You start looking at a guy like Jose Ramirez, who is further down the line as far as arbitration goes than Francisco Lindor. Is he a guy that they start thinking about long-term? Two guys that were anchors on this team all the way through the playoffs. And, Lindor was the one guy who from start to finish really performed offensively and defensively. So, is it possible that, and leaning back in this market and perhaps waiting for a Napoli who might be outpricing himself right now, and we'll get into some other possibilities here in a second, but is it possible that the best way for the Indians to move on this offseason is to lock up some of their young guys through perhaps 1 or 2 years of free agency, like Francisco Lindor, like Jose Ramirez, or and then maybe make a trade Or might they put it off another year and perhaps really outprice themselves if Francisco Lindor actually comes out in year 3 and has an MVP caliber season? You could almost smell that sort of thing coming as he gets more and more footing in this major league kind of landscape. Now you're talking about a guy who's got playoff experience. You've got a guy who really kind of led the team offensively in the World Series. Lindor, to me, seems like a guy who the Indians need to jump on now. And we're talking serious money. I mean, I don't think in the next year or two it's going to raise their payroll too much. But let's say that they do just bump Ramirez and Lindor. I mean, this is going to put another perhaps $3 or $4 million on that 105-ish number. Internally, might they have to be internal? Might they have to look at Michael Brantley and perhaps a rebound year from Yan Gomes as their off season?
I think so. And that's the other part of the Encarnacion deal. I mean, even if the Indians had the capital to do so, you would essentially give up on the extension of Lindor, I think, if you sign an Encarnacion. I don't see it in the cards where you could get basically we'd look at buying out his RB years and then getting a couple of option years, which I think at this point, is going to run you close to $100 million.
Yeah.
A really significant cost, and Ramirez isn't going to be cheap either, and he shouldn't be. I mean, they'll get a team-friendly deal. But those are huge long-term financial commitments that I just.
But yeah, I mean, you got to think that J-Ram's looking at least a Kipnis sort of deal, right?
Yeah, I would bet. So I think they are in a predicament where that's the case. I also think probably the move to DH first base type guy is the way to go for Brantley long term if he's going to stay productive. And I also think the Gomes bounce back is a thing that I think is sort of. I don't think he can move to first base and still be a valuable Major League Baseball player. Even when his bat was really good, even if he's 95% of that, that production doesn't actually play that well at first base. It just plays really, really well at catcher value wise. And I think Gomes has to sort of rebuild his value behind the plate. Or that's going to be kind of a tough contract for the Indians. They have options at the end, but it's going to be escalating a little bit. It's going to be something that's going to be tough for them to move.
Yeah, so this is where, I mean, it is a bit of an unknown. It's good to hear that they're kind of making waves, and another report today said that they were more in tune to free agents than they were to trading, which is interesting to me as well. And I do, I keep thinking to a piece that Jeff Nomina wrote, and God, he's going to listen to this and think he's God's gift to baseball now. He's probably going to start making his own commercials about baseball and clothing, but I digress. He did write a post today talking about the Indians kind of standing pat in the outfield. And, I think, when we consider going all in for the Indians and we talk about their risk averse kind of management style, a lot of people point to last July as being, this is their way of kind of announcing to the world that they're not going to be risk averse anymore. The other way to look at this, Mike, is they took a team that was going to win the division and they made them a World Series contender by going all in and trying to get both Andrew Miller and Jonathan LaCroix. They end up getting Miller. The cards end up falling a little bit different. LaCroix doesn't sign, but they still more or less kind of went all in. However, to me, that was a risk-averse move because they were betting on a team that was already going to win the division. Is this their market inefficiency? Do they not make big moves unless they are locked and loaded for a run at the playoffs? I mean, that LaCroix deal to me is the insane deal of the two, because they were willing to offer 4 prospects, 2 of which pretty big time prospects. You could argue maybe 3 of those guys, if you include Greg Allen to that, which I would, for really 1 year and a couple months of Jonathan LaCroix, a position where in year 2, they were going to have 2 other catchers. So are they going to be passive this offseason, as Jeff suggested, and then jump all in July once again when they can more or less control the market and perhaps make a splash in the outfield if they need to, while at the same time they can see what they actually have in Bradley Zimmer, and then ultimately maybe a guy like Greg Allen. Certainly Andy Diaz gets a look. Is this just the Indians are going to look for a guy? I'm surprised they didn't go all in on Steven Pierce, but are they going to look for a guy, $6 or $7 million guy? Hope he can get them to June, and then really make a splash at the summer deadline.
Yeah, it's really sort of a shocking possibility in that we traditionally think of the summer deadline as, a time when you pay $1.25 on the dollar, more than you would expect in the offseason. So, but the Indians did this thing where they basically destroyed the entire marketplace for relief pitchers, changed the price, and now this offseason teams are basically paying for the Indians' success in dealing for Andrew Miller, which is actually very interesting, and I think in some ways provides them an opportunity to strike in a different category if a player sort of slides in cost. But I do think that's possible, and I think the Indians have so many dudes in the outfield that I think they sort of like the idea of it sorting itself out. I mean, I think Zimmer, regardless of his warts, will be ready to try Major League Baseball pretty quickly. You have Chisenhall, you have Naquin. I mean, these are guys who are like part-time starters. Some people think Naquin's a full-time starter. Is Brantley going to be healthy? Brandon Guyer's a brilliant sort of platoon matchup for either Naquin or Chisenhall in right field. Can Zimmer play center? And I think they're sort of in a position where they say, we have the best rotation in the Central, maybe in the AL. We have the best bullpen in the American League. We have a solid lineup. Maybe we just let these things figure themselves out. And if there's a problem or if we want to sort of move parts around, we will when we need to. But, we're already in great position to win a really weak AL Central. And we'll sort of wait for value where it may fall.
Yeah, well, I think the big curiosity will be what kind of minor league deals do they get? Do they look at a guy like Tyson Ross? Do they bring in some of these injury-prone guys that they've been so good at healing in the past, and can they get some value there? It should be a lot of, I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I think that if we really pay attention to these winter meetings and they come out of the winter meetings without making a deal, if we really pay attention to what they're doing and who they're talking to, I think the next 2 or 3 weeks after that could be interesting. I also think the Indians could be a player in the Rule 5 if they do see a guy that's out there. I could see them taking a flyer, perhaps on a bullpen arm, looking for, again, a market inefficiency. We shall see. But, Mike, looking back on, maybe a discussion we had almost 3 years ago when we were, podcasting for CSI, I think that we had this long, could you imagine the Indians spending $9 million on a bullpen arm and us actually saying it's a deal? I remember, I think this conversation was, who was it? Who did we sign? We signed someone, $4.5 million, $5 million to be our closer. Oh, who was the guy? It's going to drive me nuts. I'll come up with it in a second. But how this, coming full circle for me, Mike, but is the price tag of some of these players concerning to you with regards to the Indians and their window? Because the salary, we talked about John Jay, a kind of an offhanded conversation in our last podcast. And you made a note, that perhaps a guy like, if Lonnie Chisenhall's, released DFA, he would be a guy on the open market that could possibly sign a 2-year, $18 million, $19 million contract. That's concerning to me for a market like the Indians, where, these prices seem to be pushing pretty high pretty quickly. Now, there's always going to be guys to fall through the cracks, but is this sudden kind of, I say sudden, maybe it's not. Am I wrong? Does it not feel sudden to you that these escalating prices for guys like, some of these relief pitchers that we see going out there, is that concerning, or is it just one of those supply demand things where people are reacting to Andrew Miller, as you really talked about today in your piece at WFNY?
Yeah, I think it really is concerning, and there was a really good comment, and I won't remember it, where I sort of argue that it's advantageous now, but I didn't talk about the long run ramifications. And for the Indians, I talked about the fact that they beat a lot of teams to a market hole. They beat it, a lot of teams to having one of the few best relievers in the game at a really cheap price, and then they sort of inflated the price of it in elite relievers and beat everybody to that hole. And in the short run, it's awesome. And, somebody responded and said, well, isn't in the long run this pretty bad? And it certainly is not good for the Indians in the long run. But the counter is, the Indians, to sort of contend in the long run anyway, have to constantly find these holes. At some point, some other position or asset is going to get sort of deflated in value, whether it's power. I think we're seeing this offseason that the Indians might be able to buy some really cheap power or something else. And so you never know what it is, but the Indians have to be, if they create a hole like this in the market, they then have to beat organizations to another hole, or else the window is going to close for a little while until they can find a hole again. And I think getting there first is awesome, because I think it's going to shift proportional spending for the next few years, and that's advantageous for the Indians finding the next hole, but they may not. And then it's going to be really scary.
It's I think the scary thing for me, and we've talked about this before, is when you have an organization like the Yankees run by Brian Cashman, who for many years many people looked at as kind of a laughing stock for some of the moves that he had to make under old man Steinbrenner. Seems like the younger Steinbrenners, after maybe a year or two of kind of following in their father's footsteps, have more or less given Cashman the reins. And it seems to me the teams currently like the Yankees, and you could say with Epstein in Boston and kind of in the aftermath of Epstein for a little bit of time, they were kind of running in the same way. The Cubs certainly now you can look to with Epstein there. The Dodgers are spending money like crazy, but they are an interesting look too if you really kind of focus in on the moves that they've made in recent years, in the recent year, I should say. A lot of these big market teams are starting to play almost an unfair brand of baseball, because they work obviously with their, fiscally, they don't have to worry about some of the things that we do. And at the same time, you've got a guy like Cashman now, like Theo Epstein in the past, who run to Andrew, Friedman, who we've talked about a lot. They run their franchises, even though they have the money to spend, they run their franchises very similarly in a lot of ways to the Indians now, where, you talk about, perhaps Holliday being that kind of market inefficiency at 1 year as an older guy. You see the Yankees go quick, something that the Indians have done in the past. Is this something where, as the Indians front office continues to thin out, that the Indians really have to be concerned about? Because if they're only a week or two ahead, now we're 6 months ahead with the Andrew Miller signing. If the Yankees are really paying attention and Brian Cashman is doing these types of moves, he made a series of moves at the trade deadline opposite of us that looked a lot like moves that we would make, selling off and acquiring these, the Clint Frazier's and a whole slew of people, just trading off two relievers. Are we bound to now be competing with these big market teams now, and are they competing with us in a way that really makes the market extremely unfair in a fair sort of way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. That's such a bright front office, and I wrote about it today in a sort of in a way that was really positive about how the Indians handled the situation. But the Yankees beat everyone there, right? And in some ways they cashed out too early, and in some ways they cashed out at the right time. But they essentially got Chapman and Miller for what is now insanely cheap, flipped them for two assets, two prospects. There are other parts, but they get Gleyber Torres, who's fantastic in the Cubs deal. They get Frazier, who's the Indians, probably top prospect. So they also did swimmingly, except they had the assets to grab two of those guys, turn them into long-term studs who they can have who are cost controlled. So that super sucks if you're the Indians. Yeah, it's concerning. Every organization now has these front offices loaded with scouts, with educated economics majors.
Yeah.
It's the margins are getting thinner and thinner for smaller teams to take care of.
Well, and year after year, Mike, the Indians front office gets absolutely ravaged. One or two guys go every single year. I think something needs to be written, not necessarily on the brand of people coming out of the Indians organization, because I think you and I have both been very high on every guy that's left, but the depth that guys like Mark Shapiro, you can even, let's be honest, the one, probably John Hart's best acquisitions in his career as the general manager in Cleveland weren't on the field. Those were guys that were already here from Hank Peters. Really John Hart's brilliance was in the guys that he put underneath him. Think of the depth. A year after year, one or two guys end up in a big position in another franchise, and the Indians still plug along. I mean, is it one of those cases where there's so many Indians guys out there? I mean, you can point to 12, 15 franchises that now have an Indians guy somewhere in the top 3 or 4. I mean, is this one of those situations where people are ravaging the Indians organization at the front office level and using them in the same way that Billy Beane did with the Indians organization when he started Moneyball?
Yeah, it stinks, doesn't it? It's the worst.
Well, this is where, your piece kind of stands out because, you wrote about that this morning, by the way, and I'm saying that with emphasis because, of course, as we've been noticing over the past few weeks, when Mike writes a piece, similar pieces start to come out. I'll just leave it there. But, I think when you put that piece out this morning, it was one of those things, Mike, where this is why, not only should Terry Francona get credit for how he's handled the team on the field, but this is where that front office and why when Chris Antonetti wins awards, it makes sense because he continually, the value that they lose from year to year and the fact that Chris Antonetti-led front office and the way it's been led since 2008, 2009 when he took over from Shapiro. No offense to Shapiro. But really, a lot of credit has to be given to Antonetti because he still does have a 6-month gap on these teams. And a lot of people come to me, well, Chernoff really runs no, Chernoff does not run anything. Chris Antonetti runs everything. He is vice president, president in name only, president in name only. This guy runs the entire, this is not Shapiro handing off the reins to Chernoff. Antonetti runs everything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't want to downplay the role that Chernoff plays. And also I think, the promotion to GM for him was something of the Indians really investing in the value that he's had long-term and sort of protecting their asset from going somewhere else. I think it's a signal that they think Chernoff is, a really important part of the management team. But I think it's pretty clear that Chris Antonetti still holds the reins when it's decision-making time.
Yeah. Well, and again, for the Indians to make Chernoff the GM, that says, we just talked about the value of a lot of these guys in the front office. If he's the guy that Antonetti picks, obviously Chernoff has a big future, really young guy, who obviously in the coming years will probably get more and more of the reins as Antonetti. I just don't ever see Antonetti giving up the reins. This is not Shapiro, who has his eyes on, making stadiums better and, moves to Toronto and kind of doing the same thing there. So getting sidetracked, though, let's move back to kind of player acquisitions. And, as the Indians kind of look for their market inefficiency, some interesting rumors came up. And simultaneously today from 3 different places, I get a text at work from an old EHC comrade, Joe Cuneo, who says, what do you think of this guy, Yann Solarte? And of course, Solarte is a guy I think that, is a kind of an uber utility guy. People who like Jose Ramirez, of course, probably pay a little bit of attention. If you pay attention to the major leagues, a little bit of Solarte. He can play first, though, and third base and can play a little bit of second as well. He seems to be a guy who fits into that mold of Terry Francona that, moving a guy around. To me, a guy like Solarte, if the Padres truly are interested in getting rid of him, and rumors are they're looking for a shortstop, and no, we're not talking about, Francisco Lindor. They're talking to guys like Eric Ibar and, old, really bad shortstops. To me, the Indians could be a fit because we have a couple of younger guys, one who's major league ready and Eric Gonzalez, who you and I could have a whole podcast talking about, maybe not in the way that most people do, but he does have value in that. I think, if given a circumstance on a team like the Padres who want to go younger, don't want to spend a lot of money, he could be the centerpiece of a prospect-laden deal. If we're talking dream sequences, and again, Solarte has not been connected to the Indians, but as far as pieces go, you talked last week, Mike, about perhaps the Indians looking at third base to kind of free up Jose Ramirez. To me, kind of looking at Solarte, with kind of fresh eyes, since we've been looking at outfielders this whole time, Solarte brings an incredible amount of value to the Indians if they can somehow figure out a way to get him without giving up a major prospect. You've got a guy who can fill in at third base to allow a guy like Jose Ramirez to play left field or to maybe give Lindor a day off. He then, when Jose Ramirez comes back to play third, can bounce back over to first base and be a primary first baseman for most of the year. Again, sharing that with a guy like, Carlos Santana, who then can DH. To me, just on paper, a guy like Solarte, who has that kind of plus bat, who's got a little bit of power, who's got, a lot of nice little intangibles, seems to be a pretty good defender at all the positions on the infield. To me, this guy seems like a no-brainer look, at least for Chris Antonetti and the Indians.
Yeah, what is the toughest part of this offseason to you? The toughest, no, and I'll leave that to you in a minute, but the toughest for me is the Indians had this giant cloud named Michael Brantley. And I think there's a very real possibility that they could have a very significant need to fill that slot. There's a very real possibility he could need to transition positions, or there's a very real possibility that they buy into him being healthy and anchoring in left field next year. And I think so much of this offseason is sort of driven by something that I have no understanding of, and that is what the Indians actually expect from Michael Brantley and what his health looks like. And to me, if you go utility guy to move Ramirez to left, I think you do that based on the, sort of the assumption that Brantley's not that guy anymore, which may be really true. And in which case I favor it if they know that already. If they don't, then it's not as important of a need. It's so hard for me to consider needs when I just have no idea what Michael Brantley is anymore. And it makes it, I think it makes it really complex.
Well, the fact that the Indians could bring in a guy that potentially could allow Brantley to play minimally in left and DH at times. And, when you have this kind of this ability as a Solarte to bring in and it perhaps curb a little bit of that play in left field. Of course, it was announced today that Brantley was going to be able to, man, how many podcasts have we how many times have we been in on a podcast where we've gotten a report that Michael Brantley is going to continue swinging? And I know your reaction to it, Mike, because it's my reaction too. I wince a little bit thinking, why start swinging the bat right after Christmas? Why don't you just wait a few more weeks? I eat some turkey, go run some laps. I don't know, get a rubber band, talk to, play with some, get with our boy, Trevor Bauer, play with some drones. It makes me nervous. I mean, I'm happy. I want to see him come back. I want to see him healthy. But, the enticing part of Brantley is if he does come back healthy, and let's say they do bring Napoli back. Let's say they bring Napoli back, but Brantley comes back and he's somewhat like the player he was prior, regardless of the shoulder. I mean, that makes an kind of Napoli kind of okay, because all of a sudden you can slide Napoli down to 7 or 8 in the lineup. And you can put Brantley in. I mean, again, a lot of the things that we talked about with trading last week with Nomina, extending that lineup, Brantley by himself does that. So, and it goes to a lesser extent, if he can come back at all offensively and be, a fairly decent, a little bit above replacement offensive player, again, this lengthens the lineup. But Brantley you're right. I mean, Brantley's the key. I mean, right now, Brantley's the key. If we get him back healthy, it doesn't matter what we do this offseason. He lengthens the lineup immediately, and anything else that we do is icing on the cake. But if we don't address it and he's not healthy and we don't get a first half of a season from Mike Napoli, it does make things a little more difficult. Now, we proved last year that we can play without Napoli and without Brantley because we did it all the way to the World Series Game 7. The question is, and that's with Napoli actually taking up a spot on the lineup. So I don't know, man. We're in a very strange place because we're coming off of a Game 7 World Series, and we may have more money than we thought. And we could go for the home run and compete with the Cubs offensively if we go out and get a player. Or we could just be the same team we were last year, which went to Game 7 of the World Series and still has weapons to trade and still has minor league guys to bring up. So this is a very different conversation than we had in March, where we were like, man, if this outfield doesn't work, we could suck. We're not, and actually we didn't say that, but it did seem to be the difference between a division winner and a World Series winner. And the outfield ended up being pretty good, got us to where we needed to get, and it was pretty miraculous. To me, Mike, the narrative should be Brantley. The narrative should also be the rotation. And I only say that because I don't think in a million years we thought last March that the rotation would end up being Corey Kluber and some duct tape. So if Carlos Carrasco and Danny Salazar can give their maximum output as they did for much of last year, well, Carrasco until he got hurt, Salazar until he got hurt. If Salazar can look like the Salazar of the first half and Carlos Carrasco just comes back and is Carlos Carrasco, that could supplant Michael Brantley in importance, because again, then as you mentioned, we have the best pitching staff in the American League and the best bullpen in the American League, and I think that alone can do it. So do we have to do anything? Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. But would Solarte be that fit though for you?
Yeah, I'm definitely really interested in Solarte, and there are a lot of guys. I think the nice thing is, while I do think Ramirez's versatility is more limited on the Indians than many say it is, just because we have stars at second and short, I do think that it does provide enough that Solarte is really interesting in guys like him. And I'm really bad with Solarte. I honestly don't have enough background on him. I know Kevin Dean's been trotting him out there. I know you've been talking him up. I just don't have enough buy-in. I don't have enough background that I can be bought in on it yet. But the people I trust are pretty in on the idea, so I'm good to go with
it. I think that it's kind of neat that his first name's Jan. So, how many teams in the history of baseball have had two Jans on their team? So we could just start there and just kind of leave it alone. All right. I do want to say one more. I do want to say one more thing before we cut out tonight. First of all, if Mitch Moreland gets signed by the Indians at some point in the next couple of days, we immediately will podcast, because I want to hear Mike Hattery rant on that. But don't worry, Mike, I'm not going to talk about Mitch Moreland. I do want to talk a little bit about the 10-day DL and the potential that the Indians could utilize their current roster without bringing back a Napoli, and perhaps, utilize this bullpen and this rotation in a very unique way by utilizing this new 10-day DL. What advantages do you think, just offhandedly, do you think that this 10-day DL could bring a team like the Cleveland Indians, especially the way Terry Francona likes to use his bench, likes to use his bullpen, likes to use his rotation, likes to use his 24, 25 spots on the roster? How does it benefit a guy like Terry Francona, and how does it benefit a front office like the Indians, who do like to kind of utilize their full 40-man?
It's awesome. So one of the really important things is that, first of all, it shrinks to 10 days, which is really interesting when you think about a starter, because you can have a guy go for a start and then miss maybe just one start if you play it right, but just take a start off. Say, I have arm soreness, give a starter a week off, and you don't lose him for 2-3 starts, 15 whatever days. You just lose him for maybe one start if you time it correctly. The Indians, the other thing that it does is that generally we have this rule. We used to have a rule regarding when you can be called up and down, and it's to avoid shuttling players. But as soon as a player goes on, the injured list, the disabled list, that sort of resets the clock, so you don't have to wait a certain period of time to recall a player. So having that 10-day rule where you're going to be using the 10-day a lot more frequently also means that you're going to be able to be more flexible with bringing guys up and down. For me, the Indians pose a wonderful opportunity, and I don't think it's going to happen. But if there was someone who was ever designed to completely change the way the Indians pitched, Bauer is really interesting to me. He would throw 3 innings every 2 days and be the happiest guy on earth. His arm is built for that. And I think you could sort of get really progressive with maybe piggybacking guys like Tomlin and Bauer, and pitching Bauer relatively frequently, and sort of going a couple innings at a time, and then shuffling relievers up and down from AAA to just sort of eat innings if you need to. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting. I don't think, probably won't happen, but I would love it if it did.
Well, and you and I, off air kind of wondered out loud whether or not the Indians and Major League Baseball in particular, would be frowning upon that and perhaps trying to figure out a way to curb Major League teams to do this. My question, though, is when something gets put into the CBA like that, it almost feels like a countermeasure to something else. Like, okay, we'll put this in knowing this is what you're going to do with it, but we're going to put it in so that we can get this. So is it possible, Mike, that this was put into the CBA as a way to do this? Is this one of those things where, the Players Association, the players themselves and Major League Baseball are kind of nudge, wink, winking, knowing that this is a way to keep the players happy, and that, some players that have arm trouble as the year progresses, this is a way for a guy like, Danny Salazar, for example, to perhaps elongate his career, elongate his season, because, you can give him the rest. You can give him the rest on the DL, and he can come back fresh after that rest. I mean, he basically did that twice this year anyways. Was this put in the contract specific for teams to be able to manipulate it?
I absolutely think it is, and I think it's amazing with Salazar. I think the ability to retain a 25-man roster and only miss one start, but also get that guy like 8 or 9 days of rest, is a huge advantage, and something that's going to be really useful with protecting Salazar's arm if he doesn't go for surgery. So I think it was designed for that reason, and I think it's fantastic.
Well, and what can really get fun with this, Mike, is, you can make your 25-man roster look a lot like a 40-man roster, because this all of a sudden can get you really manipulating a 40-man, because you can also start maneuvering, depending on who you send down and bring up, or put on the DL and bring up. I mean, you could start utilizing, guys like perhaps Yandy Diaz a little differently. You could have him come up for a bit, send him back down for a bit, bouncing him around with pitchers. The same goes for a guy like Bradley Zimmer. If you believe that it's time to start his clock and you bring him up sometime in late June or even before that, this is an interesting way to perhaps, utilize the offensive side of it and defensive side of it as well. Also getting guys eligible for the playoffs down the road, should they desire to do that. A guy even like Greg Allen, you could bounce up for a game or two, maybe replacing a pitcher, and then sending him back down to bring up another pitcher. I don't know. There's a lot of different, as I was trying to map this out, and Mike and I talked about this, 5 or 6 days ago. I literally sat down and started mapping things out. And when it really started getting interesting to me is when you'd send a pitcher down, and instead of bringing another pitcher back up, perhaps you utilize a 26th man on offense, perhaps, bringing up a guy like Yandy Diaz for a specific game, putting him at third base, putting him in left field or center. I don't know. It could be a lot of fun, especially for a guy like Terry Francona, who likes to manipulate. And hey, I mean, what a great way to keep Michael Martinez on this team.
No, I think you make a fantastic point, though. I haven't thought about it as much in the platooning sense, but I think this is a roster we're looking at that could be sort of left-handed hitting heavy, that crushes right-handed pitching but can struggle a little bit against left-handed pitching. And I think having that flexibility where if you're going to face 2 or 3 lefties in a row, you flex Yandy up, and you flex out a starting pitcher on the 10-day DL for a little while. You go platoon advantage with Yandy for a couple of days, send him back down just so he continues to get playing time. I think that's a really interesting creative outlet.
Oh, and it makes a lot of other guys viable here and there. I mean, it does make a guy like Eric Gonzalez interesting, because you can use him defensively specific if you need to get Francisco Lindor a break. I mean, this is a way to do that. It could make even some guys, some blasts from the past, from the Indians organization who are kind of ready, who had some decent quad A years in Columbus. A guy like Ronnie Rodriguez could be a guy you bring up. I mean, you do have some interesting guys down there, 5 or 6 of them, who are either going to end up being impactful major leaguers or could just be kind of these gluey sort of pieces like Ronnie Rodriguez, who could kind of come in and fill a little bit at a time without it really hurting you. I think as the year progresses, and I'm sure, Mike, you or I are going to write a piece on this at some point that's going to be ripped off by everybody. But, I digress. Someone's going to write a piece at WFNY, and we're going to see it at every avenue that there is out there. And I am going to say another thing about this in a second. But it is something that I think the Indians, we talked about market inefficiencies. I think this could be the next one if the Indians are at the forefront of that. And I would expect someone like Joe Madden to just utilize the hell out of this, especially with a lot of young guys that the Cubs have in the upper levels of their minors. I mean, this could be something that the Cubs just absolutely destroy to make their team that much better without having to necessarily bring anybody in. I digress though, Mike, and we got to wrap this up. It's been about an hour, and I do want to wrap it up. I want to save some stuff for later, because if they do have something happen in the winter meetings, I do want to pull you back in for another podcast. But my question is this: do you have anything that you want to plug? And just be careful, because if you plug it, chances are pretty good in about 5 minutes, 8 major avenues in Cleveland are going to actually publish the same exact story.
Yeah, I wrote a thing about the Indians and bullpen, and this is something that this is worth another conversation, because I don't want to be snipey, and I think that, I've looked, and some people were sort of tweeting about the same thing today around when my article went up. So that's fine. That's really good. But
I do want to say though, Mike, you have been talking about writing this piece for 2 weeks now. I know we were talking about some interesting things coming up at WFNY, and this was one of them. You and I off air were talking about it. This is something you've been working on for a while. It does piss me off that you put something out and then 2 hours later, the same story comes out. I mean, just me.
Yeah, it's when it just happens once or twice, I think everybody who blogs is sort of used to it with, major outlets and other blogs. You're used to it. It happens. And you've had it happen to you a lot with some really good work. But I think, once it's just become such a frequent thing, and it's really, to me, it's not that hard to drop a link. And even if you didn't sort of steal, even if you had the same idea and just published significantly later, I think, to me, just drop a link in and say, this is someone with similar thoughts on it. If you want to compare, it's not that hard, because, if you have a tweet that sort of triggers something in me to write an article or provides good information, I'm going to drop it in my article. So, for me, it's not a big deal. But when it happens a lot and we don't sort of respect each other enough to drop a link in, don't love it.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I think when you and I were writing at EHC, people maybe, sniping stuff from us there was one thing. But, at WFNY, I think our goal is going to be a lot bigger than it was at EHC, and our coverage of the Indians in particular has been fantastic. And I'm not just patting myself on the back. If you know me, I don't have a giant ego whatsoever. My life is spent not having an ego. I mean, I guess I'm sometimes narcissistic, as we all are, but I think that, as Mike said, I drop the link, because it really pisses me off to see a friend of mine spend hours working on a piece that he's been thinking about for 2 weeks. And then 2 hours later, someone who believes they have a bigger kind of avenue posts the same story with a little tweak here, a little tweak there. And again, I mean, I'm not saying Mike and I and other writers at WFNY and anywhere else for that matter, or, have a beeline on a specific skills and specific writing, specific ideas. And certainly the Andrew Miller thing is not something that only Mike has thought about. That being said, I mean, 4 hours later, come on. It's just garbage. I'm getting sick of it. And now that perhaps we have a bigger voice at WFNY, and I mean, I think, WFNY provides coverage across the board for Cleveland sports as well as anybody, perhaps doing that when we're at WFNY is not the way to go, because, I mean, people see what we post and they get that people rip it off. So I don't know, maybe stop doing it. Just a thought. There's my 2 cents. I do have something to plug though. One, make sure you read Mike's piece today on Andrew Miller, a fantastic piece. Make sure Mike has had a series of interesting pieces on Jose Ramirez that need to be read. Please make sure you take a look at his center field outlook. Please make sure that you take a look at several of the stuff that he's written. Make sure you check out the Indians coverage. We have a lot of fantastic stuff up there. And also, I've got a really fun piece coming out about Greg Allen. I really, really, Mike, don't want Greg Allen to be our Kenny Lofton in that we don't realize his value and send him off in a deal. I'm so glad that he didn't go to Milwaukee, but more on that tomorrow. More on why I mentioned Kenny Lofton with Greg Allen tomorrow. This won't be going up till tomorrow, so I guess saying today is that, so I'm not really giving up. But I got a really nice looking piece on Greg Allen coming out. Perhaps our answer in center for the future is residing in probably Akron for about a month, and then Columbus, and who knows, by July. So
Yeah,
I'll leave it there.
I'm gonna plug to agree with Jim. I'm really excited about this article. I haven't previewed it yet, but we've been talking about this in texts and DMs, and Jim's sending me all this information. I'm really excited to read it tomorrow. Or today. It's gonna be must read. So check it out.
Well, it's what you know me, Mike. It's one of those things that starts off as kind of this little flame that I think is ridiculous, and then you start reading a little bit and you start thinking, how in the hell is Greg Allen given a low ceiling when everything that you see, just because he's already done it, that doesn't mean he can't do more of it. Everything you see of this guy, he's fast with plus speed. He's got a really good arm that nobody talks about because heaven forbid he can't throw it through a wall like Tyler Naquin, which unfortunately happens a lot because rarely does he throw it right to the catcher. He has good route running. I mean, hello, that's kind of important. He runs incredible routes. It's going to piss me off because next year, if he doesn't make the bigs this year, people are going to be talking about him as potentially our number one prospect out of nowhere when it really shouldn't be out of nowhere. But I digress. Read the piece. It'll be out tomorrow, today. I don't know, sometime. So read that. And just keep paying attention to WFNY's coverage of the Indians over the winter meetings and over the offseason as hopefully you'll see it's fantastic coverage and listen to the podcast here at WFNY, which is really odd for me to say, but still very viable. Make sure you go to iTunes, go to Waiting for Next Year, click on the 5 stars, because what you're really doing is you're helping out, Craig Lindahl, who runs everything. You're helping us out with the EHC podcast, and you're helping out WFNY as well. And make sure you click on our Patreon page and check that out as well. So closing up shop, I know I rambled a lot there, but such is life. That's who I am. We will catch you on the flip side, which may be sooner than you think. The Mitch Moreland podcast might be in our future, Mike. And that will just be me saying Mitch Moreland and not saying another word.
Yeah, like the Trent Richardson podcast.
Oh, you won't have me defending Mitch Moreland, my friend. We'll be on the same side. I just won't have to say anything. So what do you think? The Browns going to draft a running back in the first round?